Hi, my name is Olivia and welcome back to my channel. So about a year ago, I decided that I was going to try and read A Game of Thrones in 24 hours. And I vlogged the whole experience and I'll link a link to that up above. Essentially, I set myself this goal to help me get over my fear of reading some of the huge fantasy books on my shelves. And it definitely helped in that respect. I was able to get through it quickly and I had a great time doing it. I may come to regret this, but I've now set myself the goal to read The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss within the span of 24 hours. And if this is something that proves completely unrealistic, I may have to extend this to a 48-hour vlog. And if you've seen the title, you already know the outcome of that. So I'm hoping I can finish it in 24, but I'm not beating myself up over it if I can't get it done then and have to extend it to 48 hours. My edition of the book is 661 pages, so this is going to be a huge undertaking, but I've cleared my schedule for the next day or so. It's about 1:45 in the afternoon right now, and I've decided I want to start my readathon at 2 p.m. on the dot. That way it'll extend from 2 p.m. today until 2 p.m. tomorrow, and I'll be filling you in with my progress as I go. This is my first time picking up a Patrick Rothfuss book, but I figured it was about time since he's one of the huge big-name gurus in adult fantasy. He's been on my radar for years and years now, and I don't have a good excuse for not picking up his book sooner. So with that, let's get into the readathon. But first, coffee. This lighting is something else, but that's because it's about to start thunderstorming here. I'll try to catch some of that on camera if I can, but no promises. Anyway, I've now got my coffee, I have my book, and the clock just hit 2:01, so it's time to get this readathon underway and start reading. I don't know if you can hear how hard it's raining right now, but it is absolutely pouring. I love the sound of rain, especially when I'm reading, so this is the perfect reading mood to kick off this readathon. I've just barely started The Name of the Wind. I'm about 5 pages in, and I'm already completely sucked in. It surpassed all of my expectations in the first 5 pages alone, so that has me feeling really optimistic about the rest of this book, and about the series in general. Already, I can tell that Patrick Rothfuss has a really engaging and compelling way of storytelling, and I think that's going to make the length in this one no problem, and it's going to feel like it's flying by. I'm hoping this momentum continues for the rest of the readathon, and maybe that bodes well for finishing this in 24 hours. I guess we'll see. I want to get back to reading and try to make a bit more of a head start on this one. The rain just stopped, so it's a little bit brighter in here. Yay for better lighting. It's a few minutes after 3, and I just reached page 49, which is the start of chapter 7. So far, I am very intrigued and drawn into the premise of this book. It seems like there's quite a big air of mystery, and we don't really have a good idea or full picture of what's happened in the past to lead up to these events. Going along with that, the opening of this book was one of the best introductions that I've ever read, and it felt very reminiscent of the start of A Game of Thrones, where you know that something's a little bit out of place, out of the ordinary, but you don't have a good idea of what is truly going on and how it's going to impact the characters and the plot down the line. I'm still very much in the dark as to what's actually going on, even at 7 or 8% of the way through the book, which has me even more intrigued and wanting to continue reading. I also love the choice of setting for this book. So far, it's taken place primarily within an inn, and that provides a great crossroads for individuals to come, both from the surrounding town and travelers, and they come share their stories, and the innkeeper begins amassing these stories, listening and not really contributing. So I think it's a really unique setup, and it provides sort of a normal backdrop for what this world is typically like. It's also given a little bit of insight into some of the lore and history of not only the immediate surrounding region, but also the rest of the world. I think this is really setting the stage for some great world building and some great backgrounds, both for the characters and some of the events that they participated in previous years. The writing style is also incredible. It's very beautiful and lyrical, and it's a little bit heavy on the description, but I've been loving it so far. I can see how it wouldn't be for everyone because it's highly, highly detailed, and it does take a little bit of time to wade through it and figure out what's going on, but I think it's completely worth it, and I think it adds so much depth and character to this story. It also lends itself well to quite a few hilarious one-liners, and I'm really enjoying a lot of the dialogue in this book. and the interplay and interaction between some of the characters. The relationships are entertaining to say the least, and I've barely even made a dent in this book. So I can't wait to see how things continue to progress moving forward as we're introduced to more and more characters. So far, the pacing hasn't been particularly fast, but I think that was something that was done intentionally. It seems like Rothfuss is really taking his time to very intentionally set the scene and give us a backdrop for what a normal day in the life of these characters is supposed to look like. I have a feeling all of their lives are about to get a lot less normal in a chapter or two. So I like having that sort of calm before the storm that allows readers to figure out a little bit of what this world is all about and what's taken place in the past. It also provides an interesting point of comparison between ordinary life and whatever huge event is about to probably change this world and all of the characters' lives. I've reached the point in the book where the protagonist is about to start recounting his story to the chronicler, and I'm intrigued to see what the balance is going to look like between present events and past events from history that are being retold. I think there are so many ways that Rothfuss could balance the two, whether it be a 50-50 split or giving far more time to one timeline than the other. I'm already so incredibly interested in the timeline in the present, so I can only imagine that the timeline in the past is even more exciting and high stakes. I'm really eager to continue reading, so I'm going to get back to that for a few hours, and I'll update in a bit. I just reached page 92 in the book, and it is even more impressive than I first thought when I was starting out. I'm really loving the flashbacks and retellings from when our narrator was younger. It's so interesting to see him as a child and compare that to who he's grown and become over the years. And while we're still missing quite a few steps in between there, I think those are all going to be covered pretty in depth, and I'm curious to see what all of those progressive steps are. The section of the book that I just finished focused quite a bit on his training and his initial exposure to magic and an individual who practices magic. That's generally not my favorite portion of fantasy books. One that immediately comes to mind that didn't do a great job of this was the Aragon series by Christopher Paolini. In this book, and in a lot of other fantasies, there seems to be so much time spent on training and learning a new skill or craft, and it gets very monotonous and repetitive over time, getting pretty boring pretty quickly. Part of what's so interesting in this is that it's showing us more of how the magic system works and how it's viewed through the eyes of other people in this world. I think that's helping to keep it fresh, exciting, and it's keeping me interested to see what he's going to learn next and how it's going to progress from here. I'm also incredibly enjoying the choice of narration style, especially with the ability to reference events that happen later on that readers aren't aware of, but that all of the characters have lived through or have heard of because they were so famous and widespread. That's definitely helped to pique my curiosity, and while I still feel like we don't know a ton about this world and its history and some of the recent events, I think it's all going to become clearer further on in the book. It's very clear that Rothfuss is setting himself up well for an extremely exciting plot, and he's definitely dangling bits and pieces of information in front of readers as a here's something that's coming up. It's really, really interesting and really important, but I'm not going to tell you about it now, so you need to keep reading to find out about it. While taking that stance in writing can get a little annoying after a while, I think he's walking that very fine line on the right side of this. He's keeping me interested, but not making me frustrated over a complete lack of information. Even in the little bit of the book that I've read so far, we've gradually gotten to learn more and more information, but he's not revealing it all at once. He's definitely not info dumping, and that's something that I think is really unique and strong about his writing. I want to keep reading for a bit longer. I'm starting to get a little bit hungry, so I'll be making dinner shortly, and then hopefully getting back to more reading later on tonight. It's around 7:15. I just ate a quick dinner, and it's storming once again. I don't know if you can hear all of that rain and thunder in the background, but it's coming down pretty heavily on the windows and the roof. I had a little bit more of a chance to read right before I ate dinner, and I reached the 130 to 140 page mark, around there. I have to say, this book has taken me completely by surprise. I was expecting it to be a decent first start to a fantasy series, but wasn't expecting it to wow me and impress me so much. I think one of its best attributes is the writing style and the narration. Those are the two things that have really sucked me in and really kept me reading. I think even if I wasn't filming this for a 24 or 48 hour readathon, I would have trouble putting this one down. It's definitely one that's very thought-provoking, and the few times I've taken a break to do other things, I've still continued thinking about the plot and the characters. I'm also finding the magic system fascinating, and while it hasn't been very well described so far, I'm thinking that'll be coming down the road. But I like learning about it in bits and pieces, rather than being fed all of the information that's known about it all at once. I'm very, very glad that info dumps were completely avoided, at least so far in the book, because I could see how they would be a very easy thing to fall into and incorporate way too often in the narrative. I'm also hoping there's going to be a little bit more explained about the world and the relationships between some of the different nations that are listed on the map. We really haven't explored much above and beyond the inn and the local town that surrounds it, so I'm looking forward to seeing some different locations as the tale is recounted from the innkeeper's childhood. And with that, I'm going to jump back into reading, and I'll try to update at least one more time tonight, if not more. And it's about 7:30 the next day. Unfortunately, I fell asleep reading last night, so I didn't get the chance to update, but I figured I would take a few minutes right now to do that before I get into reading for the day. So last night, I stopped at chapter 34, which is around the 218 page mark, and I am loving this just as much as I did when I first picked it up. I still stand by my previous statements that one of the strongest components of this book is the writing style. It's lyrical, it's beautiful, it flows very nicely. It's also descriptive enough that you feel like you're actually in these settings, but it's not too descriptive that it really starts to detract and take away from the other components of the book. Another thing that I'm really enjoying is the narration style. I think Rothfuss made a great choice choosing to tell this book from the perspective of a character recounting their life story, rather than just detailing events as they're unfolding in a present tense type of setup. For one thing, we get to see our protagonist reflecting on events as they're unfolding, and he's providing this active commentary of, I was so naive in this situation, or I made some bad decisions in this situation and it gave me consequences later on. So it's really interesting to get some of those insights way before we would have seen them if this was told in present tense. I also think there's an added emotional aspect for this narration style. Instead of some third-person omniscient narrator who has no real stakes in what's unfolding and doesn't have an emotional tie to the other characters and plot points, I think in this case we're getting to see the gradual breakdown of emotions and how each emotion affected him and influenced his actions and decisions later on. Some of the scenes that come to mind in particular have been some of the more sad, gut-wrenching scenes where you can tell he's having a hard time narrating these stories and reliving the event. I don't think these scenes would have had the same effect if they were told from a different perspective or in the present tense. I think it's really, really important that we're hearing a character reflecting on these after the fact. It also sets up the narrative really nicely for foreshadowing. We've already gotten hints and clues about some of the events to come, but we're still very much in the dark about many of those. We have a vague idea that something big is coming, and some of the events have some consequences down the line, but we have no perspective of what these are. I think this type of setup can get a little bit dangerous and be tricky to execute, but so far Rothfuss has been doing a decent job of it. I find it more of a problem in thrillers, where the authors like to dangle the fact over readers that all of the characters know more than you know. And it's sort of this unfair, cheated feeling that you get when you're reading those, because you're gradually getting more and more frustrated with being constantly kept in the dark. Here though, because it's one singular character who's in the know, and he has a handful of other characters hanging on his every word as he's telling the story, I very much feel like I'm one of those other characters listening in as he's recounting these tales. I think that also speaks to the immersive nature of the writing style, which again, I cannot get enough of, and that is one thing that has kept me so invested in this book. Progress-wise, I was hoping to be a little bit further of the way through the book. I'm just about a third of the way through right now, and I'm not sure how well that's going to bode for finishing this in 24 hours. Well, I'm still going to give it a fair shot. I think I may have to extend it a little bit more. We'll see. And with that, I'm going to get back to reading and try to finish this book up soon. It's a few minutes after 10, and I just reached the 280 page mark. I have to say the book is a little slower going than I was originally anticipating, and I think that's partially due to the dense writing style that Rothfuss uses. Not that I'm complaining about it by any means, because it's been my favorite components of the book so far. but I definitely don't think I'm going to get this one finished in its entirety in 24 hours. So let's see how quickly I can wrap it up above and beyond to that. As I read further and further into this one, it's becoming more apparent how important storytelling is in this world. Not only is our protagonist recounting a story to some avid listeners, and that's what we're hearing for the narration of the book, we're also getting exposure to other characters telling stories, particularly when they have an audience of children who are requesting all of these tales of heroes and wars that were fought seemingly a long time ago. I think that provides further proof that this was a really strong narrative choice to tell it from this storytelling point of view, especially with how important some of these legends and tales are proving to be in the book as a whole. At a little under halfway through the book, I did not think I would be this immersed and engrossed in the world already. In not that many pages, Rothfuss has already established this very descriptive, detailed world and has really made me feel like I'm a part of it while I'm reading. With that being said, there are some components of the world that haven't been particularly well established or at least explained to readers. One of those is the religion and this emphasis on sort of a gods versus demons hierarchy. We know that demons can be killed by iron or fire, but above and beyond that, we don't know much about them. I can see how this ambiguity could be used down the line to build suspense and make it that much more of an enticing read. But right now it's a little frustrating to feel like all of these characters are well aware of the legends and stories of these religious figures. But as a reader, I'm sitting there very, very confused and very lost. I also think storytelling is going to play a huge role in revealing more information about the religion, especially how demons came about and the impact that they're having on the world and the characters. But as of right now, I'm still feeling a little lost and confused when it comes to religion, as well as the holidays. Holidays seem to get thrown around left and right as a way of passing the time in the book. So they'll mention, oh, this holiday is coming up, or this holiday just passed, but they only mention it by name. They don't give any additional descriptors. As a reader, I have no clue what these holidays are, and I only have a vague idea of what season they're located within, just based on clues from the weather, the temperature, whether it's raining or snowing. It seems like these holidays are very closely intertwined with the religion, at least in this world and the few towns that we've been exposed to so far. So I'm hoping that as we learn more about one, we'll also learn more about the other. But overall, that's a very minor complaint. I feel like everything else has been pretty well described and well explained so far, especially in the short amount of time that it's taken Rothfuss to do all of these things in the world, in the plot, and in the character building. With respect to the plot, it's been incredibly fast-paced so far, but I also have zero clue where it's headed. I have a few potential ideas, but nothing very solid or backed by evidence and facts from the book. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that's headed in the future. We're on our walk, as you just saw, and it's an absolutely beautiful day out, especially compared to yesterday with the storms both in the afternoon, and it actually stormed for most of the night as well. Since it's so nice out, I think I may bring my book out here and try to read for a bit, maybe for an hour or so before heading in, making some lunch, and then we'll see where the afternoon takes us. It's about 1 o'clock and I'm officially over halfway through the book. It's definitely a slower read than I was originally anticipating. The writing style has really slowed me down a bit, so it looks like I won't be finishing this in the span of 24 hours. So I've officially decided to push this out into a 48-hour readathon. I managed to read a little over half the book in 23 hours and managed to get quite a bit of sleep and do some other things outside of reading. So I'm feeling pretty confident that I can have this completely finished by 2 p.m. tomorrow. With respect to the book itself, it is a solid 5-star read for me so far. I wasn't sure that we were ever going to see our narrator reach the university and actually begin his studies there, so I'm very glad that's been a major plot point in the book. I'm also appreciating the extremely detailed descriptions of his schooling and the time that's being spent, giving real insight into what day-to-day life looks like at the university. I have to admit, it reminds me a little bit of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter series and gives me those same feelings of nostalgia, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. Even though I've spent the past 70 or so pages, give or take, reading about the narrator's experiences at the university, I feel like there's still so much more that we don't know as readers, and I'm looking forward to uncovering that as I continue reading. I'm also finding it interesting how the narrator appears to have this constant savior complex and superiority complex as well. He's really placing himself above a lot of his classmates and even some of the professors at the university, which has gotten him into quite a bit of trouble so far, and I can only imagine it's going to get worse from here. I can definitely foresee some big negative event coming along in the next few chapters or so to sort of knock him back down and remind him of his place and that he's not yet all-knowing. He's at the university for a reason, and there are people who are more educated than he is on certain topics, and he could definitely use to learn from some of these people. I think these character traits have really driven home that he is truly a flawed character, and that's part of what makes him more realistic as a reader. Helps him come across as more three-dimensional and also helps me sympathize with him as we're watching him go through some of these tough, sad scenes and all of the hardship that he's had to deal with throughout life. Reading about the university also has me very, very intrigued about the magic system and how much more we're actually going to be finding out about it. So far, the narrator's time at the university has primarily been spent detailing his relationships with fellow students as well as some of the professors. And we haven't really gotten a lot of insight into what he's actually learning on a day-to-day basis. I think Rothfuss is walking a pretty fine line here. He could very easily take the story in a direction where it's so focused on the detailed information that he's learning day in and day out, in which case it would risk the book becoming a little bit boring, especially if there's no other plot or major action events coming into play. On the other hand, if he just completely breezes through and skips over all the information that they're learning in classes, I think I would feel a little bit cheated, and it definitely wouldn't provide an accurate representation of what it's like to attend the university. All in all, I still have a lot of questions about the university, about the world, and even about some of the characters. A lot of their intentions aren't really clear, and it's been tough to figure out who's a friend or a foe to the protagonist. I think he's being intentionally obscure and ambiguous about this, and it's definitely something that's going to come into play down the line, and I can't wait to see how that's going to be executed. With that, I'm going to keep reading. Hopefully I can make a pretty big dent in this book this afternoon and into this evening, and I'll update again shortly. I just reached page 425, and it's a little bit after 4:30 in the afternoon. So far, I'm really loving the detailed glimpses that we're getting to see into the narrator's life at the university. This has definitely provided a great segue into Rothfuss revealing more information about the magic system and the world, especially the different geographic regions and the people who come from these areas. All of this is presented in a way where it really does not come across as an info dump. It's more of an interesting history and background to all of the people and places that the narrator is learning about. I've really been enjoying reading about his time at the university, and I'm dreading the point at which it has to come to an end. I'm not really sure whether that's going to be in the next 10 pages, the next 100 pages, or even in the second or third book, but something tells me that this is definitely not going to last forever, and I should try to enjoy it while I can. On a completely unrelated note, I still haven't been able to connect the dots between the different timelines. The first timeline being present day, as the narrator is recounting all of these stories and working as an innkeeper, and the second timeline being in the past, when he's at the university and attending all of these classes. It seems like there is a pretty big time gap between the two, and it's clear that there are quite a few events that have transpired between point A and point B that readers still aren't privy to. As of right now, I'm not really sure whether that timeline's supposed to be completely filled in this first book in the series, or whether that's going to take 2 books or even 3 books to get a better picture of how the narrator has progressed through all of these different life stages. So it'll be interesting to see how Rothfuss decided to resolve this and what direction the book is going to take from here. It definitely feels like we're at a bit of a turning point. I'm just not sure what's in store in the future. And with that, I'm pretty eager to keep reading, so I'm going to read for a little bit longer, make some dinner, and I'll check back in after that. It's about 9 p.m., so please excuse the lighting. But I just reached page 490, and I think I'm going to start winding down for the night, maybe read a little bit more, and then pick back up again tomorrow. At this point in the book, there are so many different subplots that are going on simultaneously, and this is one of the rare cases where I'm finding myself interested in every single one of them. Usually I tend to gravitate toward 1 or 2 of the subplots, and the others sort of fall by the wayside. I find that I don't really care about them and try to hurry through those sections of the book to get to the ones that I'm more interested in. This usually results in me finding certain portions of the book very fast-paced and exciting, interspersed among some slower, more boring and dull scenes that I'm not really engaged in or excited to read about. I'm so incredibly happy that that's not the case for this book. At almost 2/3 of the way through the book, I'm still feeling invested in every single subplot and every single character that we've come across so far. There are just so many moving pieces in all of these plots, as well as in the world overall, and I'm finding myself transfixed and fascinated by it all. The sheer complexity of all of these individual pieces and how they come together to form a whole narrative is one of my favorite aspects of the book, at least so far. I think setting up this type of narrative leaves a lot of room for error, but Rothfuss has avoided all of my major frustrations and complaints with previous fantasy series, so that's definitely something that I've enjoyed while reading this one. With that being said, this type of setup for a novel leads to quite a bit of information being thrown at readers along the way. I think the only book that I could really compare this to would be A Game of Thrones, albeit at a much simpler level. A Game of Thrones has 10 times the number of moving pieces and characters and storylines to keep track of, so it's definitely in a league of its own and a bit of a different scale and magnitude. By comparison, I found The Name of the Wind to be much more manageable, and information is given to you in small increments, so it's much easier to digest and keep in mind as you continue reading. Rothfuss also has a way of giving readers subtle reminders as to information that they previously learned that has now resurfaced and become much more important. And I find that I really enjoy these little refreshers. They're not something that I found repetitive or burdensome, and I actually appreciate them, especially when I've forgotten a few details along the way. I've also found that there aren't as many characters as I was expecting, especially for a fantasy series. The cast of characters is pretty small, and we interact with all of them regularly enough that I don't really have an opportunity to forget who a certain individual is, what their history and background is, and what they've done in earlier portions of the book. So while there are definitely a few parallels to A Game of Thrones, The Name of the Wind is a much less intimidating and strenuous read. Therefore, for someone who's just starting to look into fantasy series, I would definitely recommend starting with The Name of the Wind over A Game of Thrones. I think it's a much easier introduction to the genre, it's a much easier and quicker read, and it's not as tolling while you're reading to keep track of all the little details and characters. I definitely wouldn't peg A Game of Thrones as an introductory fantasy series, but I think The Name of the Wind definitely has the potential to introduce some new readers to the genre. And with that, I'm going to sign off for tonight, read a little bit more, and I'll catch up with you tomorrow. It's about 8 a.m. the next day, and I just got to page 561. As I'm continuing to read, this is reminding me more and more of Game of Thrones and the premise that's set up, especially the first book in that series. One of the biggest comparisons and overlaps has been the discovery of creatures that are a little bit reminiscent of the White Walkers, in that they were previously only thought of as a piece of folklore and the subject matter of children's stories. But when they're discovered in person, people are reluctant to believe that they actually exist, and you get the sense that it's setting up for some bigger conflict later on in the series. While both of these series have incorporated the same basic theme and introductory plot points, I think they've gone about it in very different ways. And it's very clear that their execution is also very, very different. So despite the fact that I initially noticed this overlap and have been searching for even more comparisons that I can draw between the two, they really deviate from one another after this initial setup. I think this also ties into the concept that it's very, very rare to get a completely original story. You're undoubtedly going to have overlap with some other authors and some other works, and I think this is just a product of that. Ultimately, it hasn't hampered my enjoyment at all because it is executed so differently. I don't feel like I've read this storyline before, and I think that's one of the things that sets it apart from the Game of Thrones series. I'm also nearing the end of the book with only about 100 pages left, and as of right now, it's looking more and more like there's not going to be a resolution to the narrator's story, at least in this first book in the series. It definitely seems like it's going to spill over into later books, which had been a question that I had earlier on while reading. It'll be interesting to see how Rothfuss decides to split the book up and what breakpoints he's going to use for the tale. As of right now, I'm not sure if there's going to be a natural breakpoint where it really does make sense to launch into the next book in the series, or if it's going to be something much more abrupt because there is no good breakpoint. I think if Rothfuss decides to go the latter route, it could be a little jarring, and I think it would be a tough transition from the end of book 1 to the beginning of book 2, especially if you let a lot of time pass between reading the two installments. On a bit of a separate note, I am not crazy about the love interest and the romance that's beginning to develop. I don't see any chemistry between the two characters, and it's just not a believable romance to me. They don't seem to get along, they don't seem like they would be compatible whatsoever, and maybe that's partially what will make them a good pair in the future, but as of right now, I'm not seeing it. The scenes where both characters are present are just tense and awkward, and their interactions are downright uncomfortable. So I'm hoping this doesn't become a focal point for this book or any future books in the series. It's definitely not one of the strong suits, and I didn't pick up this series because I was looking for a romance. If anything, I was looking for something far, far from it. I don't see this particular relationship ending well. I think it's going to cause a lot of hardship and tension between the different characters, so I'm hoping it's something that doesn't last very long or progress very far. And with that, I'm going to keep reading, and I'll update again shortly. I just passed the 600-page mark, and it's a few minutes after 10 a.m., so I think I'm doing pretty well, and I'm definitely on track to finish this book within 48 hours. One thing that surprised me within the past 10 or 20 pages that I read was that the climax seemed completely wrapped up, which was definitely earlier than I was expecting. I was under the impression that this book was going to follow many other fantasy series that came before it, which all placed the climax at the very end of book one, which set up the stage for some great cliffhangers, where you don't get complete resolution of all of the plots and what happens to each character. That's definitely a more traditional setup for a fantasy series, and it also brings readers back to read the second, third, fourth, whatever book in the series. So needless to say, I was a little confused and shocked to see that the climax has already come to a close, and we have just over 60 pages left. There was definitely a big build-up to the finale, but it seems like that is completely over at this point, and I'm not really sure what is going to fill the remainder of this book. Most of the plot points have already been resolved. We know what happens to pretty much every character at this point, and there's no real uncertainty or questions remaining. So I'm intrigued to see how Rothfuss is going to convince readers to pick up the next book in the series. He's not going for any of the traditional cliffhangers that you typically see in these larger fantasy series. So I'm wondering if there won't be one at all, or if he's doing his own unique twist on a cliffhanger that I just haven't read before. I must admit, I'm a little bit worried that this is going to turn into 60 pages of complete fluff to merely extend the book, and it's not going to add much substance or plot to the series as a whole. That's definitely a concern of mine, and I'm very much hoping that that's not the case. It seems like Rothfuss has done a great job so far of crafting a story where he's only including relevant information and relevant tales. This equated to not a lot of fluff for the first 90% of this book, and I would be really disappointed if he began incorporating that at the very, very end. That would definitely have the potential to tank my rating. And up until this point, this book has been a solid 5-star read for me, and one that I would classify among my favorite fantasy series of all time. It also doesn't seem like 60 pages is enough time or enough space to introduce new plot points, new characters, and new character arcs. I think that would just result in a big mess of confusion where you have these half-started storylines and then have to pick up the second book in the series to get a little further in those. Past series that I've read that have done this have failed pretty miserably in subsequent books in the series, so I'm also hoping that's not the case. I'm not really sure what to expect, but I want to figure out how this book is going to end. So I'm going to keep reading. It shouldn't take me too much longer to get through this, and I'll update again once I've finished with the book. It's about 12:30, and I can now officially say that I've finished The Name of the Wind, all 661 pages, and on top of that, I successfully completed my 48-hour readathon. I initially set out very, very ambitious that I would be able to finish this one in 24 hours, but I quickly found out that the writing style is just not conducive to that type of quick reading. It definitely took me a while to get through this one, much longer than I was anticipating, but I loved every second of it, and this is officially a 5-star read for me. Personally, I found the strongest components of the book to be the writing style, especially the choice of narration, as well as the world building, the magic system, and the plot. All of these things were very excellently done, and that definitely contributed to me flying through this book and being very eager to pick it back up whenever I stopped reading. The character development was also well done, but we only got to see a very small sliver of it, and only for a small number of people. I think we're going to see that expand in later books and see some more development to each of the character arcs, which is definitely something that I'm looking forward to. My one and only complaint for this one would be the ending. I thought the very conclusion of the book was a little weak to say the least, especially those last 60 pages that I was originally concerned about. It definitely seemed like the climax happened way too early, and then we were left with 50 to 60 pages of sort of confusion and wrapping up a few little details here and there, but there wasn't a whole lot of substance in those final pages. They were more to tie up a few loose ends, which I think easily could have been addressed in later books in the series. There was nothing urgent about them, there were no time constraints on when they had to be dealt with, and I would have preferred seeing those pushed back into other books in the series. All in all, that was a bit of a minor complaint, and it was the only one that I had while reading this book. So I would consider it a very successful fantasy series for me. I already own the second book in the series, The Wise Man's Fear, and I'm going to be picking it up very, very soon. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read this series in particular, or if you have any recommendations for other fantasy series that I should pick up and try to finish for 24 or 48-hour readathons. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.